Welcome to Climate Unipod. I'm Rayu.
I'm Ellen, and now let's delve into the spirit of climate innovation.
Ryan Handy is a former newspaper journalist turned urban planner. Originally from Santa Fe, New Mexico, she worked for newspapers in Texas and Colorado, covering the environment, state politics, renewable energy, and oil and gas regulation, among other things. She left journalism in 2019 to get a master's in urban and regional planning. Prior to joining the Lincoln Institute, she worked as an urban planning consultant for a development firm in Jackson, Wyoming. She is currently a policy analyst and planner at the Lincoln Institute, focusing on scenario planning. Her work focuses on training communities in the practice of scenario planning and using that practice to prepare and plan for uncertain futures. In both her journalism and urban planning professions, her passions have been addressing climate change and its effect on the American West. To find out more about Ryan and her work, please use the links in our show note. And now, here's our conversation.
Thank you so much for joining me today.
Happy to be here.
I look you up and see who you are and what you do. It's so interesting, the trajectory you've been taking. And so, can you just talk about what are you doing now? How did you get here? And the different kind of roles that you've taken on path?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a sort of interesting path to get into urban planning, as we refer to it in the United States. I actually was a journalist for over a decade. I was a newspaper reporter, which sounds old school since newspapers are kind of a dying breed, but I actually got a master's degree in journalism, and I'm from the Western United States. So I worked at newspapers in the Western United States. And after many different years, I eventually ended up covering mostly environmental issues in journalism. And by accident, I lived in several major U.S. cities that had major climate-driven crises that I ended up covering and spending a lot of time working with as a journalist. And one of these was Hurricane Harvey, which hit Houston, Texas in 2017. And at the time, I was actually an energy reporter. I was writing about oil and gas development, which is a major economic force in Houston. But I was diverted and ended up covering Hurricane Harvey, which hit Texas as a hurricane. But by the time I got to Houston, it was a tropical storm, and it dumped roughly 51 inches of rain in a couple of days, like 5 feet of rain on Houston in just a matter of really hours. And a lot of my work as a reporter after the hurricane hit was about land use and how climate change intersects with land use. Why do we live in these areas that are prone to climate-driven disaster? Why do we continue to build in areas that are prone to disaster? And how do we rethink living in areas that climate change is going to transfigure and difficult to live in? And it was a central problem we dealt with as reporters at the newspaper because Houston has a major flood driven by climate change every year. People would just rebuild their homes in the neighborhoods that were doomed to flood again. And when I was living in Houston, I thought, no one really seems to be actually changing how we live with climate change in a city. So at the time, I was really thinking about getting out of journalism for various reasons, and I decided that planning would be my exit because planners think about how we use the land, how we build on it, and are also at the forefront of how we live with climate change because they think about how our cities adapt to it, thinking about how we live differently with it. So that's how I came to planning. I worked as a planning consultant in the Western United States, and now I work for the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. My title is a policy analyst, but really what I do is I work with scenario planning. I teach communities how to use scenario planning. I train people on how to do it, and I help further the practice. And scenario planning is really, I think, one of the most accessible tools for planning for climate change. It helps people envision alternate futures, some of which are climate driven, some of which are not, and helps them plan and prepare for them. And at least in the United States, a lot of American cities don't have the ability to plan for climate change. It's expensive. It requires expertise. It requires a big planning staff, which the major cities have. Middle-sized, smaller cities don't. So scenario planning is a crutch in a way. It gives these communities resources to think about climate change and how it will affect them without the expense and the difficulty that they might not be able to afford.
That's a journey.
Why it's great.
Yeah, about scenario planning, it's more participatory, maybe also democratic process. Is the system set up for it to be easier to translate that decisions back into policy?
That's a really great question. One of the biggest challenges we face with scenario planning in the US is that it doesn't easily fit into our planning structure. Scenario planning is, as you said, very participatory. It really gets down in the weeds with community members. And our planning structure is actually not very well adapted to that. It's becoming more friendly to it. But there's a couple of problems. One is in the US, there are certain types of plans that are mandated by the government. If you're a transportation organization, you have to come up with a plan, and sometimes comprehensive plans are mandated. A lot of municipalities spend their time doing these plans that they're required to do for the government. But figuring how to shoehorn scenario planning into these prescripted processes is very difficult and is sometimes too difficult for communities. It's people often are like, I want to use scenario planning, but how do I plug it into this process I'm already required to do? And the answer is often, I don't know. The second challenge we have in the US is that we have public participation as a mandatory part of planning processes. You have to have public meetings. You're required to by law. You have to give a certain amount of notice for the public meeting to give people time. You have to notice it in certain ways. You have to put ads in the newspaper, put things up online. You have to do it a certain time before. But this public meeting process is notorious for being not inclusive. An example is sometimes public meetings are in the middle of the day, which if you're working, you can't go to a public meeting in the middle of the day. Or at night, if you have kids or work multiple jobs, you can't go to a public meeting. Officials haven't thought carefully about where is a public meeting? Is it easy to get to? Is it hard? Traditionally in the US, a lot of our public engagement has been for people who are older, wealthier, and generally whiter. And so the challenge planning has had is to make public participation more diverse and more inclusive of people who have different realities. They work multiple jobs, they have kids, they don't speak English, they're younger, they're not white. And a lot of our public participation in planning in the US is what we call tokenistic, which means you are technically getting the public's opinion, but you're not really. It's mostly the government is saying, hey, this is what we're doing, and we're telling you in a public forum, but we're not actually going to listen to you and get your input. So scenario planning is conceived as a way to fix this, to be really diverse, to actually get people engaged in planning processes, finding answers, suggesting things that they want. But the challenge is, as I said, it's a complicated process to plug into this government structure that we've had around for decades and that we're very wedded to.
Yeah, I find so much, not with the scenario planning, but with the public participation, what you're saying. If you're trying to get people's opinion, you can only go during the week when the government works, but then half of the population doesn't work. And then the other half, they might not actually understand your questions.
But it's still the same sort of problem. It's about meeting people where they're at and finding ways to allow them to meaningfully participate in planning. And I think the United States in many ways is still struggling to figure that out, even amongst people who are familiar with some things. The barrier to participating in planning is so high.
I want to actually bring it back to,
Yes,
it is about innovation. A lot of times when we were talking about innovation, people picture something more technical or something about gadgets or with technology. So I was wondering, do you think, given the situation with public participation, do you think scenario planning is a more innovative way of doing planning and public participation?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think scenario planning is very innovative in some ways. A lot of scenario planning, actually, particularly in the United States, is based on software tools, some of which are really innovative.
Okay.
But the kind of scenario planning that we teach at Lincoln is very qualitative. It's based on people's lived experiences. And that is itself very rare and I think also very innovative. As I said, public participation in the US tends to be tokenistic. It's not really about how people experience their community or the built environment or their world. It's kind of about what planners tell them. And scenario planning sort of flips the narrative. It's getting people's impressions and ideas about what they want for their community and what they can do to achieve their vision for it or to protect themselves from some disastrous outcome. But it's very common, I think, now to have like big workshops with general community members who aren't elected officials. But the piece that's often missing is how to give them a meaningful way to actually suggest changes. And the idea behind scenario planning is you're not only thinking about the future, but you're also giving the participants a chance to say how they want to deal with it. And they are supposed to be coming up with strategies to address these futures. So ideally, you're collecting some plan from this really diverse group of people, which is not typically how planning works. It's like the planners write the plan. The community's vision and the community's input on what they want to do is very difficult to bake.
Usually it's a very top down.
Yes, yeah. It's a very top down. And scenario planning just flips it to be from the ground up. And I'm not saying it works that way perfectly every time, but that is the intent behind it. And I think when done well, it can work that way.
Can you talk about in the US, like a successful case of that?
There's a lot of rich examples of scenario planning in the United States that are done on the government level. But at the Lincoln Institute, we actually just did a project that was done more at a grassroots level that was very successful that I think I should highlight. We worked with a rural community in southern Arizona along the Mexican border, a group of farmers who are losing their access to groundwater. Their groundwater is disappearing. It's going to dismantle these multi-generational farms that they have. And they have the ability to decide how they want to regulate their water. They just can't agree on what they're going to do. So we did a scenario plan exercise with them and put them all home. They came up with driving forces that they were like pressuring their community. They identified scenarios and they came up with strategies. And they walked out of the scenario planning workshop with a plan of what they want to do to protect their water or to regulate their water. And before they did this, they couldn't agree. A lot of people wouldn't talk to each other because they were so mad because everyone had differing ideas of what they wanted. And they really had no idea how they were going to begin to regulate their own water. And now they have a plan. They have a plan for what they're going to do to preserve their groundwater. So to me, that was like a huge success because they had the ability to control something in the future and they just couldn't agree on how to do it. And they did a scenario plan exercise and they came up with a plan. And these are people who are they're farmers. They are small business owners. They're not elected officials. They're not people in power. They're not governments, but they still had tremendous ability to affect change.
So if they are so mad at each other, who do you work with to get these people in a room to talk to each other?
That's a really good question. There's a lot of aspects of this project that I've been thinking about that we need to learn from closely because some of it was luck, but not all of it was luck. So the model that we used in this workshop is basically letting the community pick who needs to be in the room. So we developed like a steering committee of local people. And we asked them, who would you invite to an invitation-only workshop? 40 people. Pick them and let's talk about why you want to have them here. The strength of that is that you end up building this community-driven invitation list where people are like, I know this one farmer and he's a great guy and he says all this great stuff. We should invite him. And you build trust. People know each other. They come because their neighbor went. They come because so-and-so called them and said you should show up. So you rely on community bonds to bring people to the table. And a lot of people said, I don't like talking about this with people, but so-and-so invited me and I really admire them. So I'm going to show up and I'm going to see how it goes. And it was a lot more effective than some random person from out of state saying, can you come to this workshop? They listen to their neighbors. So that's the strength of that. The weakness of that, though, is that then if your steering committee isn't very diverse, then they tend to pick people who are like them. They tend to pick people, in this case, a lot of the people in this community were white and they were male. And so they tended to pick white males. So we had to push them to include women, include people of color. So that's the weakness of the process. But the key here was it was invitation only. It wasn't like a a public meeting in the US where you have to have it open to the public and anyone can show up. The people who show up are the squeaky wheels, the people who have a lot to say, but who may be in the minority. And the people who are too scared to talk, but have important things to say often don't show up. So the invitation only atmosphere created a lot of comfort and civility and trust.
I agree a lot of it. You need to be comfortable and trusting with the people you're in the room with. What about people moving in recently, like immigrants into the community? Has that come up as a problem?
That in communities that I've worked in specifically, that has not come up as a problem. What did come up in Arizona was because it's on the Mexican border, it's a port of entry for coming into the United States. And the government was going to build a new port of entry, which means an official way for lots of goods would be shipped, imports, exports, all that kind of stuff would be coming through this community. And it was going to change it economically and make it much more accessible to the outside world. And they generally didn't find that to be a detraction. For them, it was a huge economic benefit. But I think the problem with an invitation-only process like this is it does mean that you tend to want to surround yourself with people that you know and that you're comfortable with. And obviously, newcomers to the community don't make the short list. And if people aren't tapped into that community, then they don't get invited and they aren't included. So I think in the future, if I were to do this, I would build really strong bonds with organizations or groups that represent those people and help bring them to the table and talk to them about why it's worth it for them to participate.
So would any kind of technology help with expand would it be possible to make the room online, or is that not helpful at all?
That's a really good question. I know there are some American cities that have used online forums for public participation, and it's been transformative. Like the city of Philadelphia started doing online only public meetings in the pandemic, and it has been so much more inclusive and successful that they're not going back to in-person meetings. In my experience with the types of exploratory scenario planning workshops I do, they are very hands-on. And I mean that like really literally. People are putting sticky notes on the wall. They are writing things down. They're reading things. They're leaning over to their neighbor and talking to them about stuff. So it's a very tactile experience. And that type of workshop is really difficult to make hybrid. And I find that the hybrid people who are online get left out and don't feel like they're experiencing the process. Having said that, I don't think that means that scenario planning doesn't translate into a virtual form. In the Lincoln Institute, we do a lot of courses in scenario planning with planners in Latin America. They're entirely virtual and they work really well together on those types of courses. And they're actually usually around climate change. But in those cases, it's usually like an all virtual cohort. So you don't have to account for the in-person experience and the virtual experience.
Because of your journalistic background, I just want to have your opinion on the online form, the change in media in the past decade. Have you seen, I guess, the change in the online discourse? How do you ensure that if you go fully online, that's more inclusive? At what point does it become the opposite of inclusive? If we're not there yet, what do we need in terms of innovation to guide this online public space to be a safer, inclusive space for scenario planning to happen?
That's a good question. First of all, I know there are lots of really great scenario planning online tools. I'm not so much a tools expert, so I feel like I can't do them justice. But for me, one of the big obstacles to doing scenario planning online is actually people's access to online and their literacy for online. Particularly because a lot of my work at Lincoln focuses on bringing scenario planning to underserved communities and rural communities. It sounds remarkable, but there are a lot of areas in the rural United States that do not have broadband and do not have high-speed internet. And so if people, they may not have internet at home, they may just have a phone, which is not like an ideal way to engage in an intricate planning process. And I have also found when working with smaller communities and rural communities that even if they do have access to internet, some people just aren't on internet, online, the way everyone else is. Like a simple example, doing workshops with rural farming communities in the Western United States. We send out like a Google invitation. Some people never open it. They never RSVP.
Mm.
They'll call their neighbor and say, yeah, I'm coming to the workshop. So we set up all these like detailed processes to have them RSVP online and have it linked to an Excel spreadsheet. But some people just ran into their neighbor at the feed store or called them one day and said, yeah, I'm coming. So my first worry about making things online only is making sure that your audience has access to the internet and uses it and are comfortable using it. So that's one concern.
Mm.
The second thought is that there are a lot of really great collaborative tools that you can use for scenario planning exercise. Some of the things that I've used are like Miro boards, Jam boards, like online whiteboards where people can brainstorm and express things visually and interact with each other. It's not just like talking, and they can put ideas down. When we do these online courses with planners in Latin America and scenario planning, they have a Jam board where they all throw their ideas down. And one thing that they do that's really cool is when they build a scenario, instead of them writing words about the scenario, we have them put up pictures. And this is a real example. If the scenario was about flooding in informal settlements, areas that haven't been officially planned, what does that look like? And people were grabbing pictures from their communities, things from their phone, things they found on the internet to illustrate what the future would look like if that were that scenario. And that happens online very easily. It's a really fun exercise to do. It's all about like your audience and their literacy and what they're comfortable with. For like farmers in Southern Arizona, they needed to be around a table with Post-it notes and pens and paper. But for a group of planners in Latin America who are used to being online, like Miro boards and Jam boards online work great for them.
Yeah, it's definitely about who you're talking to.
Yeah, it's these communities that are getting left out of the climate change planning conversation. It's climate change that's cutting edge and innovative is happening in Amsterdam or New York, but it's not happening in the middle of nowhere in a rural area. But those areas are in some way more vulnerable to the effects of climate change. They may not have as many people, they don't have as many resources, and they are just as susceptible to climate-driven issues, but they don't have the resources that a bigger city would have to greet them.
Yeah, and it's harder for them just because they don't have the resources and they're not actually that aware of the situation they're in. So they are actually more vulnerable and they don't have the capacity to cope.
I know. In the US, climate change is a very political thing. And not only is it hard to like physically reach people, it's also hard to mentally reach them because climate change is not a universally accepted idea. And the phrase itself, climate change, is quite controversial. Even if people believe in the effects and they live with them every day, they prefer not to call it climate change because it's such a buzzword of a particular political idea. Again, when I was in Arizona, which is a more conservative state, and in the US, rural areas tend to be much more conservative, there were people who were climate change deniers, as we call them. But the thing that I have had to learn, though, is that they may not want to use the language that I'm using, but they're still talking about it and they still want to talk about it. And they still know how to live with its effects, maybe more so than anybody, more so than I do, because they live on the land. And so we can have a workshop about addressing climate change, but we can just abandon some of the charged language, but it has the same effect.
Do you think for scenario planning to work, there has to be some kind of buy-in from the community first?
Yeah, there absolutely has to be buy-in from the community first, which is why when we do these workshops, we call them community-based. Having people in the community who are normally not people of power, it's good to have elected officials there. It's good to have people who are in a position to affect regulatory or legislative change. But often you forget that individuals can have a lot of power too in their community, on their land, with their neighbors, and getting their participation is key. I think another thing that scenario planning needs in order to work, and I have to admit that this is not something that we are great at and something we're working at, is the after the workshop part. A lot of people in the US in particular are used to being brought into rooms and talking about issues, But people get disillusioned because then it's okay. Why did I do that? What's going to change now? So having a really strong follow up to scenario planning is key. And it's part of the buy-in. People know, okay, I just spent 2 days brainstorming all these strategies to address this problem. Who's going to implement them? Who's going to make sure they happen? And ensuring that they happen is a complex thing. Like you have to have money, you have to have champions who are willing to take them on. And I think scenario planning maybe would be much more universally accepted or adopted if there was a strong path for implementing a lot of the strategies. Unfortunately, a lot of scenario planning exercises are just community conversations and that's it. People are like, cool, we talked for 2 days. Now what?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a complex process. Like it's not easy. So we have to start from somewhere to get it going. Yeah. Well, we're out of time. I just want to have two questions. So
Yeah.
first, because of your change in profession and you've been in different world. So do you see, is there an intersection between journalism and when you're doing reporting and what you do as an urban planning professional?
Yeah. There's a huge intersection. I think urban planning, as I know it in the United States, to me is one of the more possibly influential professions on climate change. Because ultimately, how we have decided to live, how we have decided to build, is how we experience climate change. If no one lived in Houston, it wouldn't matter if there was a hurricane. It would just come in and go away. But Houston's the fourth largest American city that has been largely built without considering flood potential. And as a result, we experience climate change very acutely. One thing that I strive to do as a reporter that made me fall in love with planning was really explain how land use affects our lives in many ways that we don't understand. It affects our public health. It affects how we experience climate change. It affects our diversity, our ability to understand other people, because in the United States, there are many neighborhoods that are very segregated, either racially or economically. So really understanding how land use influences people's experiences in their city is really crucial. And if I look back on my reporting career, the majority of my best stories were about really bad land use decisions that had huge impacts on people's lives. And these included building on top of a landslide the size of Manhattan, and then the land slid and it destroyed all these homes. They also included like living in wildfire-prone neighborhoods that then burned in wildfires. They included living in cities that were prone to flooding and neighborhoods that flooded catastrophically that no one should be living in. And I really think that journalism, when done well, can help people think about whose decision was it to build here? How did we come to decide that living here was a good idea? And what were the signals that we missed along the way? And journalism really revealed to me that there are several key points when cities knew that people shouldn't be living in a place and they just ignored it. And so ideally, journalism should be shining that light on things. And for me, that was the connection between the two. And I think that planning can be so wonky and so policy oriented. And it's the mission of the journalist to make it relatable. Zoning isn't just some obscure thing in a piece of paper. It is who lives in your neighborhood. It's how you live in your neighborhood. It affects everything about your life, from what school your kids go to, what grocery store you use, if you have one, or what job you're nearby. It's really embedded in our lives.
So has your reporting career informed the kind of planner or you want to be, or the kind of planning you want to do?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I began in reporting, which is a very traditional way to begin in reporting, as a crime reporter, covering crime and homicides and police, working the night shift, which was not an enjoyable beat, as we called it. And while I was working that beat, there was a massive wildfire in the city that I was living in, and it burned 500 homes, like urban homes that weren't that far away from mine. And it totally changed the trajectory of my career. I began to think about climate and the cities we live in, and I've spent all of my reporting career chasing those kinds of stories. I've lived through multiple massive floods and hurricanes, wildfires, landslides as a reporter. And it was really reporting that kind of opened my eyes to the poor planning that we have and the decisions that we make. And I eventually, as a reporter, I got tired of not affecting change. Like, everyone gets into reporting to change something, to make a difference, to do something. And I was starting to feel like my stories weren't doing anything. They were being ignored. I wrote a story about a flooded neighborhood in Houston and no one cared. I wrote a huge story about the National Flood Insurance Program in the United States and no one cared. And so I began looking for a profession that wasn't so much about showing people how to care as it was actually changing the way we lived. And I know it's a very idealistic version of planning as well, but I felt like I needed something that actually changed things. And so that's
but
why
also the nature of media, especially as you said in the very beginning, the local newspaper and just the environment is changing. It's all consolidated. I'm not an expert in this, but from what I heard, it's just local TV or local newspaper. They're so crucial, exposing issues when they're not supported well.
Yes, that's it. Exactly. And it's part of the reason why I think democracy in the United States is weakening, is that we don't have these like local news outlets anymore that talk about community issues and reflect a community's needs. The only newspapers in the United States that are really going to survive are like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. Everything in between is going away, which means the stories of those people's lives.
Yeah, as we said before, but where help is needed the most is in the middle of nowhere. The national reporting is not going to go there.
No, the word we use for them is they parachute in. They come in for a couple days. They go to the local diner. They talk to a bunch of the old people that hang out at the diner, and they get a pulse of what's going on, and they go back to New York.
Yeah.
And that's the same thing when like climate-driven disasters happen in middle America. Everyone and their mother shows up with their TV cameras and their microphones, and 2 weeks later, they're gone. And that community is living with the impacts of that disaster for many years, but no one's covering it, the local reporters, if they're still there.
It's so interesting. I feel I can talk to you for a lot longer because I am not someone who just believe in it has to be just technical innovation. Some things are just so much more nuanced, so much more contextualized. But I'll just end on a high note. And can you talk about what you're hopeful for in terms of us being able to reach a more sustainable future?
Oh man, that is a good question. This is going to sound a bit not very modern of me, but I am really hopeful about these types of participatory planning, like scenario planning, because they strip away a lot of the barriers that divide people, technology access, wealth, access to urbanized areas, and they seek to bring people back to a level that's really hard to get at, which is like face-to-face conversations about what is happening in your community. And they also really, participatory processes like scenario planning can really help give voice to the voiceless. I know that sounds cliche, but it's true. We've cut a lot of people out of the planning process. And the whole point of scenario planning is to bring in voices of people who are not seen as experts or who are not seen as people of power. And that is, I guess, one hope that I have in the moment, at least in the US. We're becoming increasingly interested in hearing the voices of these forgotten people, these overlooked people. And there's a greater movement now than there ever has been to bring these voices into everything we do, whether it's from planning or dealing with climate change or universities or policing. We are really starting to change how we think about who we listen to and who we've given the most power to. So I have a lot of hope for that. I am not going to make major moves on the international stage when it comes to climate change. And most people aren't either. Most people don't have that much power. Most people don't have control over what their governments do on any level. And the most change that we can affect is in our own communities, maybe on our own properties. And so that's where I find a lot of hope in my work, is that there is a farmer out there who wants to farm more sustainably, and she can do that on her own without her government's approval, ideally, at least in the United States, and empowering people to know that they can affect small changes that make a difference. So I guess that's where I find hope, even as our governments struggle to find a solution to climate change. I retain hope that there's a lot more that we can do if we show people that they have the power to do it.
Yeah, I think it's extremely important because whatever that's happening in the COP28 is not directly translating into the most vulnerable communities in the middle of nowhere, adding to what you're hopeful for. I feel like it's so hopeful that there are people doing this kind of work.
You're right.
Um,
It's not easy, and I've made mistakes, and we get things wrong. But I think part of the spirit of being innovative is also being willing to try and to fail and to fix it. And
Yeah.
thus far, we have been able to do that, and it's working.
Well, thank you so much. It has been very interesting. Hopefully, our audience find it inspirational.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to Ryan for sharing with us her work and the importance and challenges of scenario planning, as well as her journey from journalism to urban planning and how one profession informs the other. As always, thanks for listening to Climate Unipod, and be sure to come back for the next episode.
So, until next time, stay informed, stay inspired at Climate Innopod.